The year was 1492, and in the marble halls of the Vatican, a father held his daughter's trembling hands as he explained why she must marry her own brother. Pope Alexander VI, born Rodrigo Borgia, spoke in hushed tones about family honor, about power, about the delicate web of alliances that kept their bloodline on the papal throne. But Lucrezia Borgia, barely 17, could only stare at the man who wore the ring of St. Peter while orchestrating what history would remember as one of the most shocking scandals ever to stain the Holy See. What she didn't know was that this marriage was just the beginning, that her father's hunger for power would soon demand she become both pawn and player in a game where the stakes were eternal damnation, and the rules were written in blood and whispered prayers. Rome in the late 15th century breathed with the rhythm of ambition. The cobblestones still held the warmth of Renaissance gold, and every shadow cast by the seven hills seemed to hide another secret, another plot. Another family climbed their way toward the throne of St. Peter. This was not the Rome of saints and martyrs, this was the Rome of bankers and bastards, where cardinals' hats were bought with Florentine ducats and papal bulls were signed with ink. Mixed from the tears of rivals, into this world stepped Rodrigo Borgia, a man whose very name would become synonymous with corruption. But in 1492, as he knelt before the altar of St. Peter's Basilica to receive the papal crown, he was simply a father who had clawed his way to the pinnacle of earthly power. His thick Spanish accent rolled through the Latin prayers like honey over stone, and his dark eyes, the same eyes his children had inherited, surveyed his new kingdom with the satisfaction of a chess master who had just declared checkmate. Rodrigo had not arrived at this moment by accident. Born into minor Spanish nobility, he had watched his uncle Alonso ascend to the papacy as Pope Calixtus III. A young Rodrigo learned the most valuable lesson of his life: the church was not a spiritual institution, it was a political machine that ran on bloodlines, bribes, and brilliantly orchestrated betrayals. By the time he was 30, Cardinal Borgia owned palaces in Rome that rivaled the Medici estates. By 40, he had fathered for acknowledged children with his Roman mistress, the Nazade Catane. By 50, he had become the puppet master pulling strings across all of Catholic Europe. But it was his children who were both his greatest weakness and his most powerful weapons. Juan, the eldest son, handsome and cruel, designed to lead the papal armies. Cesare, brilliant and ruthless, destined for a cardinal's hat and darker ambitions. Joffre, the youngest boy, sweet-natured and politically useless. And then there was Lucrezia. Lucrezia Borgia at 17 was everything the Renaissance prized in a woman and everything her father needed in a political asset. Golden-haired like her Spanish ancestors, with eyes that seemed to hold secrets even when she was merely reading poetry in the papal gardens. She moved through the Vatican apartments with the grace of someone born to power, speaking fluent Latin, French, and Spanish before most girls her age could properly curtsy. But beneath that cultivated perfection, Lucrezia possessed something that made her father both proud and terrified. She had inherited his mind for strategy, his gift for reading the human heart, and his complete absence of moral boundaries when survival was at stake. The papal apartments where the Borgia family now lived had been redecorated to reflect their Spanish heritage. Tapestries from Valencia hung beside Italian masterpieces. The scent of oranges and cinnamon imported at enormous expense from their homeland mixed with the frankincense that perpetually burned in the private chapel. Here, in rooms where previous popes had lived in austere celibacy, Rodrigo Borgia dined each night with his children, planned marriages and murders with equal enthusiasm, and transformed the Vatican into what his enemies called a Spanish brothel. But by the winter of 1493, even Pope Alexander VI realized that his family's reputation for excess was becoming dangerous. Cardinals whispered in corners about the Pope's children attending state dinners. French ambassadors sent coded messages to Paris describing orgies in the Apostolic Palace. German princes refused to kiss the papal ring, claiming it was stained with the blood of rivals and the tears of orphans. The solution, Rodrigo decided, was marriage. Not just any marriages that would weave the Borgia name so deeply into the fabric of European nobility that no one would dare speak against them. Juan would marry into Spanish royalty. Cesare would eventually abandon his cardinal's hat for a French duchy. Joffre would secure Naples through his bride, and Lucrezia would marry her brother. The first whispers began in the spring of 1494, carried by servants who had seen too much and courtiers who traded gossip like currency. They spoke of late-night meetings in Lucrezia's chambers, of Cesare entering his sister's apartments after midnight and leaving before dawn. They murmured about the way brother and sister danced together at papal banquets, how their hands lingered when passing wine, how they would disappear together during afternoon strolls through the Vatican gardens. But what the gossips didn't understand was that Pope Alexander VI had orchestrated every whispered rumor, every stolen glance, every scandal that now spread through Rome like plague through narrow streets. This was not passion, this was politics painted to look like sin. The truth was far more calculated and infinitely more disturbing. Rodrigo Borgia had discovered that Lucrezia's first marriage, hastily arranged to Giovanni Sforza of Milan, had become a liability. Giovanni was weak, his family connections increasingly worthless. At worst, he had begun asking questions about Borgia finances, about the mysterious deaths of cardinals who opposed the Pope, about the true paternity of certain papal nephews. Giovanni Sforza had to go, but divorce in the Catholic Church required grounds of either non-consummation or blood relation. Since Lucrezia had clearly consummated her marriage, she had been pregnant twice, though both children had died in infancy, under circumstances that Roman physicians preferred not to discuss. The Pope needed different ammunition, and so, in the twisted brilliance that had elevated him to St. Peter's throne, Alexander VI devised a plan that would eliminate Giovanni Sforza, while simultaneously binding his children closer to his power. The papal chambers, where this plan was born, still smelled of the ink and sealing wax that had condemned kings and crowned emperors. Here, by candlelight that cast dancing shadows on frescoes of angelic faces, Pope Alexander VI sat with his son Cesare and methodically destroyed his daughter's life. In the name of family loyalty, she must appear to have been seduced by her own brother, the Pope explained to Cesare, his voice carrying the same tone he used to discuss theological matters with visiting bishops. Giovanni will have grounds for annulment. No man can remain married to a woman who has committed incest, and once she is free, Cesare, 21 years old and already showing the calculating brilliance that would make him the most feared man in Italy, understood immediately. She married someone useful to us, someone who won't ask inconvenient questions about how she became available. What followed was a masterpiece of calculated scandal. Cesare began visiting Lucrezia's apartments at unusual hours, always ensuring that servants would witness his arrivals and departures. They were seen sharing wine that had been deliberately spilled on Lucrezia's dress, requiring her to change clothes while her brother remained in her chambers. They attended Mass together, sitting closer than siblings should, whispering during the consecration of the host in ways that made bishops shift uncomfortably in their pews. The performance reached its crescendo during the Carnival of 1494, at a papal banquet attended by half the nobility of Europe. Cesare and Lucrezia danced a Spanish pavane that left absolutely nothing to the imagination. Their bodies moved together with a familiarity that spoke of shared secrets and forbidden knowledge. When the dance ended, Cesare lifted his sister's hand to his lips and kissed not her knuckles, as courtesy demanded, but the soft skin of her inner wrist, a gesture so intimate that several cardinals' wives fainted, and the French ambassador immediately dispatched a courier to Paris with news of the Pope's incestuous children. But in her private chambers that night, as Lucrezia removed the jewels and silk that had made her complicit in her own destruction, she wept tears that her father would never see and her brother would never acknowledge. At 19, she had become the most scandalous woman in Europe, and she had done it by following orders delivered in the gentle voice of the man who claimed to represent God on earth. The final act of this elaborate deception came in the form of a letter that Lucrezia herself was forced to write, addressed to Giovanni Sforza. It contained a confession of adultery with her own brother, written in Lucrezia's careful script and sealed with the Borgia coat of arms. The letter spoke of passion that could not be denied, of sins that demanded absolution, of a love that transcended the bonds of both marriage and nature. Giovanni Sforza received this letter while hunting boar in the forest outside Milan. According to witnesses, he read it twice, crumpled it in his fist, then smoothed it out and read it again. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the hollow tone of a man who had just realized he had been playing chess while his opponents were playing war. The Pope's whore daughter confesses to being the Pope's son's whore as well, he said to his hunting companions, and I am supposed to be grateful for her honesty. But Giovanni Sforza understood exactly what the letter meant. His marriage was over, his political usefulness had expired, and his life expectancy had just become a matter of papal whim. The annulment proceedings began in the autumn of 1494, conducted in the very halls where cardinals had once condemned heretics and crowned saints. But this trial would mock every principle of canon law, every pretense of papal dignity, and every remaining shred of respect the Borgia name still commanded in Christian Europe. Giovanni Sforza arrived in Rome, knowing he was walking into his own execution, not of the body, perhaps, but certainly of his honor, his marriage, and his future. He entered the papal court dressed in black velvet, his face carrying the hollow expression of a man who had discovered that his father-in-law was not just corrupt, but creatively, brilliantly evil. The charges against Lucrezia were read in Latin. That echoed off marble walls: adultery with her brother Cesare, conspiracy against her lawful husband, and corruption of the sacred bonds of Christian marriage. But Giovanni Sforza was no fool, and he understood the game being played. When given the opportunity to speak, he rose slowly, his voice carrying across the silent courtroom like a blade drawn from its sheath. "Holy Father," he said, looking directly at Pope Alexander VI, "I will grant this annulment on the grounds my wife has requested. But let the record show that Lucrezia Borgia was no virgin when she came to my bed, and the child she carried was not conceived by her brother Cesare." He paused, letting his words settle like stones in still water. "It was conceived by her father, by the man who sits on the throne of St. Peter and calls himself the representative of Christ on earth." The silence that followed Giovanni's accusation was so complete that witnesses later claimed they could hear the wax dripping from candles 20 feet away. Pope Alexander VI, who had orchestrated countless betrayals and survived dozens of assassination attempts, sat motionless for nearly a full minute. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the cold precision of a man who had just decided that mercy was a luxury he could no longer afford. "The annulment is granted," the Pope announced. "Giovanni Sforza is no longer welcome in our presence or in our territories. His words here today will be considered the ravings of a man driven mad by his wife's infidelity." But Giovanni Sforza's accusation had already begun to spread beyond the walls of the Vatican. Within days, every court in Europe buzzed with whispers that the Pope had not only orchestrated his daughter's false confession of incest with one son to hide her real incest with her father, but that Lucrezia's miscarriages had been the result of pregnancies that would have produced children who were simultaneously the Pope's grandchildren and his own sons or daughters. The immediate aftermath of the annulment was swift and brutal. Giovanni Sforza fled Rome in the middle of the night, taking only what gold he could carry and leaving behind a written testimony that detailed every Borgia crime he had witnessed during his marriage. Lucrezia, now officially free but forever stained by scandal, was confined to a convent outside Rome while her father negotiated her next marriage. But the real fallout came in the form of European politics reshaping around the Borgia scandal. The French court, which had been negotiating a marriage alliance between Cesare Borgia and a royal cousin, quietly withdrew their offer. Spanish nobility, despite their shared heritage with the Borgias, began distancing themselves from the papal family. German princes sent ambassadors to Rome with new demands. They would recognize papal authority in their territories only if Alexander VI abdicated in favor of a morally untainted successor. Cesare Borgia, the brilliant son who had helped orchestrate his sister's destruction, found himself trapped by his own success. The incest scandal that was supposed to free Lucrezia for a more advantageous marriage had instead made both siblings unmarriageable to anyone with political sense. Cardinals who had once sought Cesare's favor now crossed themselves when he entered rooms. Young noble women who had once competed for his attention now refused to be alone with him. And in her convent cell, Lucrezia Borgia, 19 years old, twice married, and now notorious across Christendom as both victim and participant in the most shocking scandal in papal history, began planning her revenge. The letters she wrote during those months enforced retreat revealed a mind that had finally understood the true cost of loyalty to Rodrigo Borgia. Her correspondence with allies across Italy, carefully coded and smuggled out by sympathetic nuns, showed a woman who had learned to play her father's game better than he had ever imagined possible. She began gathering evidence of papal corruption, detailed records of Borgia murders, financial documents that proved the Pope had been selling cardinals' hats to finance his children's ambitions. But Lucrezia's most devastating weapon was her own confession, the real confession, written in her private journal during those silent convent nights. In pages that would not be discovered until centuries after her death, she documented every detail of her father's abuse, every moment of Cesare's complicity, every calculated step in the destruction of her first marriage. She wrote about being pregnant with her father's child at 16, about the miscarriage that had been induced with herbs provided by papal physicians, about the second pregnancy that had ended the same way. Most horrifyingly, she wrote about her realization that she was not her father's only victim, that Pope Alexander VI had fathered children with at least 3 other women within the Vatican, including 2 nuns and the wife of a cardinal who had mysteriously died of fever. Shortly after his wife gave birth to a son with unmistakably Borgia features. By the spring of 1495, even Pope Alexander VI realized that his family's scandals had grown beyond his ability to control them. The man who had once boasted that he could buy or kill any enemy now found himself surrounded by threats he had created through his own children's destroyed lives. The papal apartments fell silent in those final months of 1495, but it was not the silence of peace, it was the silence of predators circling wounded prey. Pope Alexander VI, the man who had transformed his family name into a synonym for corruption, now sat alone in rooms that had once echoed with his children's laughter and his own grandiose plans for Borgia dynasty. The frescoes on his ceiling still depicted angels ascending to heaven, but their painted faces seemed to watch him with the cold judgment of witnesses. The unforgivable sins. Lucrezia emerged from her common exile transformed. Gone was the golden-haired girl who had once danced Spanish pavilions with her brother, while European nobility watched in scandalized fascination. In her place stood a woman whose beauty had acquired the sharp edge of hard-won wisdom, whose gentle voice now carried undertones that made even cardinals choose their words carefully. She had learned the most dangerous lesson of all, that survival required becoming more ruthless than those who had tried to destroy her. Her next marriage to Alfonso of Aragon was negotiated not by her father, but by Lucrezia herself. She met with Neapolitan ambassadors in private, speaking fluent Latin and demonstrating a knowledge of European politics that left seasoned diplomats impressed and slightly unnerved. When they asked about the scandal that had ended her first marriage, Lucrezia smiled with the serene confidence of someone who had moved beyond shame into a realm where truth and lies were simply tools to be used as circumstances required. Gentlemen, she said, her voice carrying the musical cadence of her Spanish heritage, you are not marrying the girl who was destroyed by papal politics. You are marrying the woman who survived them. But even as Lucrezia rebuilt her life with calculated precision, the shadows of her family's sins continued to lengthen across Europe. Giovanni Sforza, safely ensconced in Milan, had begun writing what would become the most damaging memoir ever penned about a papal family. His detailed accounts of Borgia corruption, complete with dates, witnesses, and financial records, would circulate in manuscript form through every royal court from London to Constantinople. Cesare Borgia, meanwhile, had abandoned all pretense of clerical life. He resigned his cardinals, had the first cardinal in church history to voluntarily surrender the red, and embarked on a military campaign to carve out his own kingdom in central Italy. His army flew banners emblazoned with the Borgia bull, but everyone understood that Cesare was running not toward glory, but away from the incest scandal that had made him unmarriageable to European royalty and Pope Alexander VI. The man who had orchestrated his daughter's destruction now found himself trapped by the very success of his deception. European monarchs who had once sought papal approval for their plans now made decisions without consulting Rome. French bishops openly questioned papal authority. German princes threatened to follow the example of England's Henry VIII and break away from Roman control entirely. In his private journals, documents discovered only in the 20th century, during renovation of the papal apartments, Alexander VI wrote with the bitter clarity of a chess master who had realized too late that he had sacrificed his most valuable pieces for temporary advantage. I had placed my daughter upon the altar of necessity and found that the gods demand more than I knew how to give. Lucrezia's disgrace was meant to be our family's salvation, but I fear I have authored not our rise, but our eternal damnation. What profit a man if he gain the whole world, but lose his own soul? I'd have gained neither world nor soul, and my children will inherit nothing but the ashes of my ambition. The final chapter of the Borgia scandal played out not in the marble halls of the Vatican, but in the quiet villages of Italy, where peasants who could not read still knew the name Lucrezia Borgia. They whispered stories of the Pope's daughter, who had been forced to confess to sin she may or may not have committed, who had become a scapegoat for her family's bottomless hunger for power. In taverns and market squares, her name became shorthand for the innocent destroyed by the powerful, the children sacrificed on the altar of their parents' ambitions. But perhaps the most haunting evidence of the scandal's true impact came in the form of a letter not written by any member of the Borgia family, but by a young nun in Florence who had heard confessions from travelers passing through her convent. Sister Maria Benedetta wrote to her mother superior in 1496, "The pilgrims who stop here speak often of the Pope's daughter, and I confess their words trouble my sleep. They say she was made to bear sins that were not her own, to confess to crimes her father committed, to destroy her own honor so that her family might prosper. If this is true, and I pray to God it is not, then what hope have any of us? If the vicar of Christ on earth will sacrifice his own daughter for political gain, if he will force her to bear false witness against herself, then perhaps we have entered the age that Scripture warns us of, when even the elect will be deceived." The question that haunted Renaissance Europe, the question that echoes still through the Vatican's ancient corridors, was never truly answered. Did Pope Alexander VI destroy his daughter to save his dynasty, or did he destroy his dynasty to satisfy his own monstrous appetites? Lucrezia Borgia lived for 37 more years after her annulment, becoming Duchess of Ferrara, patron of artists, mother to 7 children, and one of the most influential women of the Italian Renaissance. She sponsored poets, funded hospitals, and left behind a legacy of cultural achievement that eclipsed even the Medici in certain circles. But in her final letter, written on her deathbed in 1519, she posed the question that her father had forced her to live with for nearly 3 decades. "I have been called saint and sinner, victim and villain, innocent and guilty of crimes that have no name in any language. But I know this truth: a father who will sacrifice his daughter's honor for his own ambition has ceased to be a father, and a pope who will corrupt the sacrament of marriage for political gain has ceased to serve God." History will remember the Borgias as symbols of papal corruption, but I pray that someday someone will remember that not all of us chose the sins we were forced to carry. The marble tomb where Lucrezia Borgia lies buried bears only her name and the dates of her birth and death. No mention of the scandal that made her infamous. No reference to the family that used her destruction as a stepping stone to power. But visitors to her grave often notice something that the stone carvers may not have intended. From certain angles, in the late afternoon light, her carved face seems to be looking not toward heaven, but back toward Rome, toward the city where a teenage girl was once forced to confess to sins that may have been her father's, in service of ambitions that consumed them all. The question remains unanswered, echoing through 5 centuries in the twisted game of Renaissance politics. Who was the predator and who was the prey? Perhaps that was always Pope Alexander VI's most brilliant and most damning achievement, ensuring that the truth died with him, leaving his daughter to carry secrets that were too dangerous to speak and too terrible to forget.